Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, thank you to our host, the Rector and Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, Professor Wim de Villiers, and also to Mrs. de Villiers, who has joined us. I am extremely grateful to Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela because it is just wonderful to be asked to speak on this really important occasion. I read Pumla's book, A Human Being Died That Night, some years ago, and I reached out to her through her publisher. And as often happens in cases like that, emails go astray and messages do not arrive where they are meant to go. And so it really is a meeting that for me is deeply meaningful to have Professor Gobodo-Madikizela ask me to speak today because I was so touched by the discourse that she was propounding in that book, which really has everything to do with today. I'm also very thankful to my co-panelists, Professor Tamar, Garb, and Professor Siona O'Connell. I'm so looking forward to the conversation, and thank you to everyone who worked to make sure that we meet today, and also everyone who has logged on. I hope that in my remarks about this mournable body and how I see that story intersecting with the issues of today's topic, I will answer your question, Pumla. If not, we can continue the conversation. Now, today's topic is remaining human, dignity and repair in the face of trauma and violence. I think many of us have seen things, and many of us continue to see things in the environment around us that do not speak of dignity. I have definitely seen such things in my environment in Zimbabwe. I see them in my travels elsewhere on the continent, and I see them in various news reports about the continent. These things that we see, which are the converse of dignity, bring home to us the need for much repair in the way we live our lives and conduct our societies on our continent. Observing such situations over decades is what informed and continues to inform my literary work, including my last novel, This Mournable Body. As this mournable body illustrates the issues under discussion this afternoon, I am now going to take a moment to recap briefly what the novel is about so that we all have a reference point for the remarks I am going to make. This mournable body tells the story of a Zimbabwean woman who lives in contemporary Zimbabwe. Her name is Tambudzai Sigauke, but I will just call her Tambudzai. As the setting is contemporary, Tambudzai lives through the crisis in Zimbabwe, not actually now in the third decade, but when the crisis began at the turn of the millennium. I set it at that time because I wanted to introduce one of the big traumas of the post-independence era, which is the land reform. This was a big trauma in Zimbabwe with really far-reaching ramifications. And in fact, the land reform is one of the plot points in the novel, whose consequences lead Tambudzai to the event where she must make her final choice in the book about who she is. At the opening of the book, Tambudzai is a woman approaching middle age. She is unemployed, although she is a university graduate. She obtained her degree at the University of Zimbabwe while it was still a reputable institution. She is unmarried, and she mourns the fact that she has not found anyone interested in marrying her. The event in the book that triggers the whole story is when Tambudzai is told she is too old to continue to live in the unmarried women's hostel where she had lived for most of her adult life, and she has to leave the hostel. Her journey to find shelter, to find employment to sustain herself, to rise out of poverty on the strength of her degree, and to find a community to be a part of, are the backbone of the novel. The journey unfolds as a series of failures at each of these tasks, with the result that Tambudzai descends into bitterness, rage, and disintegration. This downward trend is only reversed when Tambudzai reconnects with relatives, including an aunt who had been part of Zimbabwe's liberation struggle in the 1970s. And towards the end of the novel, she also reconnects with her rural family, whom she had, for most of the novel, more or less disowned. This mournable body is the story of the destruction of a person. It is the story of the death of personhood. The possibility of redemption is only pointed to at the very end of a traumatic trajectory, and this redemption occurs in the social domain, more specifically within the extended kinship structure, which is the common form of community that exists in Zimbabwe. Now, this mournable body is the final book in a trilogy. The trilogy began with the novel Nervous Conditions, which I think might be familiar to more people, as it has been around longer than this mournable body. The trilogy continued with the second volume, The Book of Not. These two books tell the story of Tambudzai's quest for education as an impoverished, young, rural female person, and her initiation into a racist, subjugating, colonial system as she grew up. My intention in writing this mournable body was to find a way that would allow the traumatized character excuse me, my intention in writing this mournable body was to find a way that would allow the traumatized character of Tambudzai to remain human in spite of the trauma and in spite of her traumatized responses to life. I have been very concerned in my literature with the themes of today's conversation, because this is what I saw unfold in life around me as I matured. And during that time, as I observed, something flagged to me that the unfolding events were matters that had to be grappled with. I am therefore extremely grateful that now, 30 years after I began the trilogy, in fact more than 30 years, I have this conversation with everyone here today. I have said that the goal of this mournable body was to find a way for Tambudzai to remain human, to overcome. This begs the question, what do we mean by human? I am not a scholar of the subject, but I have noticed that some languages, for example English, have different words for human and person. In my understanding, in this dichotomy, to be a person is to be more than to be just a human. To be a person implies some kind of value addition to the human project. There is a gap between being a human and being a person, which implies a range of being human that segues at one end of the continuum into being a person. So being human is lower, being a person is higher, and this being a person also has a range that moves further and further away from the mere human. Where this is the case, levels of humanity are inscribed into these languages from the outset. So people come into language understanding that there are levels of humanity, and some of us are more human and have more personhood than other people, and this is built into language. Many sub-Saharan African languages, on the other hand, have only one word for the two terms. I think this is a good thing for us because it implies that being a human and being a person are indivisible. There is no range. You either are or are not a human person. In their idiom, our languages tell us that a human is a human being because of other human beings. Many of the idioms of our languages express the indivisibility of being a person, from being amongst people and acting well amongst other people. So you can only be a person because you are amongst other people and you act well amongst other people. For example, a person says, "You have made me a person," when one human being does something good for another. Personhood is conferred by positive interpersonal action. On the other hand, when someone behaves badly, others say, "That is not being a person." Being a person is bound up with the social and acting positively in the social. This is to say that in our imaginary, that is, in the internal world that informed many of our languages on the continent, the quality of being a human being was indivisible from being a person who behaves in certain pro-social ways. Yes, it is valid to suggest that this emphasis on pro-social behavior created, on the other hand, an authoritarian conservative society that limited individual freedoms. It is very important to acknowledge that. The point I make, though, is that our very language encoded our positive pro-social understanding of what it was to be human. I believe we need to hold on to that. We need to hold on to the knowledge that to be human is to build society. It is to add value to the other. It is to collaborate and share and minimize suffering. It is often said that African societies do not exhibit a sense of common good. I think that our idioms of personhood show that there was a local notion of common good rooted in the positive social. I think, although it may have been buried, this notion of common good was enshrined in our understanding of being human. An important aspect of remaining human, therefore, means to retain, against all odds, these local ideas of being human. It means to resuscitate them where they have become comatose. It means to nurture them into a contemporary flourishing. I like to think that these ideas are implied in Tambudzai's journey in this mournable body. The act of striving for the positive, whether these positives are historical positives or new positives in our quasi-modern African world, confers dignity. The striving makes us worthy of honor and respect. Many on the continent may have lost a sense of what it is to be a dignified African, but we can regain it. We can draw on old knowledge of what it means to be human, as well as new knowledge to reactivate dignity. This process of reactivating old positive knowledge and taking in new positive knowledge is a process of repair. It can be compared to a situation when the body is traumatized. For example, a muscle is torn. When this happens, proteins have to be introduced into the body so that they can be used for repair. We need to build up our psychological and psychosocial resources in a similar way. Psychological and psychosocial processes also need good nourishment. Earlier, I characterized my protagonist in this mournable body as being traumatized. I mentioned some of the sources of her trauma: poverty, colonialism, racism, war, and post-independence decay. When I put the sources of Tambudzai's trauma together, one after the other like this, we can see how each of these issues perpetrated a particular kind of violence on the woman. The violence of hunger, of distressing bodily states such as pain, cold, and exposure that cannot be treated due to poverty. The violence of exclusion as a young girl from knowledge and education. The violence of being excluded from full humanity by the colonial system, and of being objectified and further dehumanized by racism, all of which turned into the violence of guerrilla warfare and colonial state reprisals against this guerrilla warfare, during which sexual violence was practiced on the female body as an act of war. Then the continuation of colonial violence as coloniality, in which black governments behave in ways that produce violence upon black bodies, and which are militarized in ways that prey on and exclude the female body. Tambudzai also experienced the violence of being an unmarried woman in a patriarchal society that militates against the feminine that is not anchored to the masculine. While violence is a normalized societal mode in many of our societies, and its impact on male characters is also described, this mournable body illustrates how the impact of such violence is mediated by gender. I mentioned before the pro-social ways of being that are part of our heritage as people of this continent, even though the other side of such a knowledge of what it is to be human can tend towards authoritarian conservatism. I'd like to conclude by mentioning another aspect of our heritage, and indeed an aspect of the heritage of all human beings, that serves us well in our journey of remaining human in the face of much violence and trauma. This is the practice of storytelling. Storytelling opens up our minds to receive the knowledge that the violence which caused us trauma did not kill us, for indeed we are still here and speaking. Violence tends to death, not life. Telling our stories in the most human way we can, including in our conversation this afternoon, is an affirmation of the social nature of being human. In this way, the practice of storytelling is a fundamental pathway towards life and towards remaining human. Thank you very much for your attention.